First, I want to say I'm very glad to be here, actually, for a couple of reasons. Hugh started by saying he was just sort of beginning his study of Sellers. I have the opposite problem. I was immersed in lots of Sellers study when I was an undergraduate. I went to Pitt, I studied with Sellers, and of course, lots of Sellarsians. But for the last decade or so, I've been working on a different project, a project of sort of telling a Hegelian narrative of the development of reason as a power of knowing. And this is a sort of explicitly post-Kantian, that, here's Kant saying, no, we need a critique of the power of pure reason. And I think developments after Kant really changed the landscape for that question. That work is now done, it's out, it's called Realizing Reason, unsurprisingly. When I was invited here, I started thinking again about Sellers, obviously, and I formulated explicitly this idea of natural truth that is in a way implicit in Realizing Reason, but I hadn't really formulated this. So I'm especially pleased to be sort of trying out this idea here. It's very new work. I will be very interested to hear what people have to say about this notion of natural truth. So impressed with how different people from different cultures live and even think, the ancient Greek sophists argued that what a given person takes to be true is really nothing more than a convention of his or her community. Grow up in one community, and you'll end up thinking that P. Grow up in another, and you'll instead believe not P. And since there is no independent, neutral vantage point from which to adjudicate such contradictory claims, it must be concluded that all truth is relative, that man is the measure of all things, just as Protagoras said. Neither Socrates, nor Plato, nor Aristotle found the argument compelling. And in their efforts to achieve knowledge of what is, was born a project that within a few thousand years would grow into that of the exact sciences. The finest fruits of these sciences are the same, not just for human beings, but for all rational beings. Although not in our everyday sensory perception of things, we can, through the progress of the exact sciences, achieve what we can think of as absolute truth. Truth that is the same for all rational beings. Sellers appears to have concluded from this promised achievement, that our community, having begun parochially as my or your tribe and progressed almost, he thinks, to the brotherhood of man, is poised to become the community of all rational beings, regardless of the kinds of bodies they happen to have. But although we, and say the rational Martians, may converge in our mathematical physics, because and insofar as that science has been purged of all the contingencies of our bodies, our histories, and our cultures, it hardly follows that we and the rational Martians could live together in a single community. Our forms of life may be just too different to sustain meaningful discourse outside of highly abstract mathematics. But what should we say of those with whom we do share a biological form of life, though perhaps not a linguistic and cultural one? Given the role that, as Sellers argues, acculturation plays in the shaping of our everyday lives, it is natural to think with the sophists that any notion of truth appropriate to our everyday lives, as contrasted with the findings of the exact sciences, must be relativized to one's linguistic and cultural form of life. Sellers argues on empirical, on philosophical, that is non-empirical grounds, that rationality is not merely a biological phenomenon, but instead emerges when one is acculturated into a sufficiently developed linguistic community. There's also overwhelming empirical evidence that one's acculturation profoundly affects the way one perceives and thinks about reality. For example, whereas basic laws of logic, such as the law of non-contradiction, were discovered very early in the history of the West and continue to provide an essential guide to what Westerners judge to be correct thinking, It is dialectical reasoning by which to reconcile or transcend or even accept contradiction that tends to dominate in the East. And in general, Chinese and Japanese thought is very holistic. If one is Chinese or Japanese, one will tend to seek to explain things by appeal to relationship and context. American and European thought is more analytical, focused on individual objects and their properties and on the laws that are taken to govern them. If one shows a clip of some swimming fish and other underwater objects in a pond, say, to some Japanese and American students, the American students will tend to report first on the fish, and the Japanese on the pond. And the Japanese students will be much more attentive to relationships among the various objects depicted than the Americans. This is studies that have been done. The two groups of students see things in radically different ways. Salarzians will not be surprised to learn that these deep cognitive differences are widely held to be, I quote, due primarily to differences in language and writing systems. Cultural relativism seems inevitable. The idea of natural truth, modeled on the idea of natural goodness in ethics, is the idea that some truths, while not the same for, that is, available to be grasped by all rational beings, as the truths of mathematics and fundamental physics are, at least in principle, are nevertheless valid for, available to all human beings, all rational beings with our sort of body and form of sensibility. Natural truth is incompatible with cultural relativism. If there is natural truth, if all human beings ought to perceive and think about at least some aspects of the sensibly perceptible world in some one true way, then cultural relativism is wrong. As things stand, of course, people from radically different cultures do perceive and think in very different ways about the perceptual world we live in. The question is, are they right to do so? Or is there, in fact, a way that the humanly perceptible world is, however we or they take it to be, a way that we, rational animals that we are, ought to take it? Are there natural truths? The question of natural truth is the question whether perception, and by that I mean the perception of us, rational animals, is properly speaking a power of knowing. It may seem obvious that it's not, on the grounds that our perceptual experiences are caused in us by brain activity that is itself caused, at least in ordinary cases, by the impacts of bits of reality on our sense organs, on grounds that what we experience is merely an appearance for which the question of truth cannot properly arise. This objection, I think, is founded on a radically mistaken conception of the nature of perception. As we will begin to see here, we must understand perception not as an appearance caused in us, but instead as a mode of access to things in the environment. I have much more discussion of this in the book. Much as the emergence of living beings, plants, say, is at the same time the emergence of significances for various natural stuffs. Water, for instance, is realized as nourishing. So with the emergence of animals capable of perceiving are realized various sensory properties of things. As plants emerge with nutritional needs, so the world is realized as supplying nutrients with which to meet those needs. And in much the same way, as animals emerge with the eyes to see, the world is realized as having a face by which to be seen. So this is kind of Gibsonian affordance kind of picture. Perception is, or at least for all that has been said so far, can be taken to be, a mode of cognitive access to the world around us. The fact that perception is sensory does not show that perception is not a power of knowing, that there are no natural truths. So the mere fact that perception is the way it is, I don't think shows anything. What does seem to show that perception is not a power of knowing, does seem to show that there are no natural truths, is what appears to be the fact of cultural relativity. It is unquestionable that our perceptual experiences experiences of things are profoundly shaped and colored by our acculturation into one or another of a great variety of natural languages. Thus, it can seem simply inconceivable that there might be some one natural truth about the world as it is revealed in our sensory perception. Nevertheless, my aim is to show that there are natural truths, and in particular, to show that Sellers provides us all the resources we need to establish that there are natural truths. I'm going to consider first two themes from Sellers that together can seem to suggest, and I think seems to have suggested to Sellers, that our perceptual capacities do not provide us a means of knowing how things are. Then I'm going to add two more Sellarsian theses to the mix, and the picture that emerges then, I think, is one according to which there is and must be natural truth. So I'm not saying that Sellers had a conception of natural truth, but what I'm saying is he gives us tools that enables us to recognize that there has to be some go to this idea. The first Sellarsian theme is the very familiar one we've already encountered, that rationality is not a biological phenomenon, but instead an essentially social and cultural one. The human animal comes to be rational only through being initiated into a sufficiently developed linguistic culture. To suppose that we could be born into the space of reasons, or could become rational in the course of our merely biological maturation, would be to fall into what Sellers unmasks as the myth of the given. As a living organism is an instance of a form of life and cannot be adequately understood except as such an instance, so a rational animal is an instance of a rational form of life and cannot be adequately understood except as such. In both cases, the form of life provides a kind of model and standard. Consider first the more general case, that of a living organism. In order to understand, indeed, so much as to identify what it is doing or what its parts are or are for, one needs to know the kind of thing it is and how things characteristically are for that kind of thing. It is only in light of such knowledge about the form of life that one can judge of this instance that it has, say, wings, though unfortunately they are so deformed in this case that the thing cannot fly as it should. That kind of judgment that those things are wings but that they're deformed is intelligible only if you know what kind of animal it is. You can't make such judgments independently of knowing the kind that it instantiates. And so it is with rational animals. We need to identify the language that the rational animal speaks, and more generally, the rational life form that it is, to know as well how things characteristically are for such a life form. For example, what various words and phrases mean in the language. And in this case as well, it is only in light of such judgments about the form of life that one can judge of particular instances, say, of the sounds that a particular person now makes, what words they are and what the person is thereby saying. This seems to me a pretty obvious point. Life forms and languages emerge only through extended evolutionary processes, and only in relation to them can we intelligibly speak of living and thinking things. As Sellers puts the point, it's a quote from Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, there is no thinking apart from common standards of correctness and relevance which relate what I do think, to what anyone ought to think. The contrast between I and anyone is essential to rational thought, end quote. And then one from Language of Thought and Communication, it is the linguistic community as a self-perpetuating whole which is the minimum unit in terms of which conceptual activity can be understood. So that's Sellers making that point. The second theme of concern to us here is that defended in Inference and Meaning, that there is nothing to conceptual meaning that is not determined by material and formal rules of inference. And now a slightly longer quote, one of my favorites from that essay. The familiar notion, Kantian in its origin, but present in various disguises in many contemporary systems, that the form of a concept is determined by logical rules, while the content is derived from experience, embodies a radical misinterpretation of the manner in which the manifold of sense contributes to the shaping of the conceptual apparatus applied to the manifold in the process of cognition. The contribution does not consist in providing plums for Jack Horner, end of quote. Thus, although, according to Sellers, language use involves both language entry transitions and language exit transitions, in addition to language moves, that is, inferences, it is only the inferential moves that contribute to conceptual meaning. Sellers' grounds for this thesis are clear, and actually this has come up earlier. Although there is an obvious sense in which rules of inference, whether material or formal, are rules, something that sets out what one ought or is permitted to do in certain specified circumstances, language entry transitions and language exit transitions cannot in the same sense be governed by rules. Again, I quote from Inference and Meaning, obeying a rule entails recognizing that the circumstance is one to which the rule applies. If there were such a thing as a semantical rule by the adoption of which a descriptive term acquires meaning, it would presumably be of the form, red objects are to be responded to by the noise red. But to recognize the circumstances to which this rule applies, one would have already to have the concept of red. That is, a symbol of which it can correctly be said that it means red. It cannot be that a relation to red objects is part of the meaning of the word red, even though a speaker of English ought to be disposed to utter the word red in the presence of red things. Because to recognize something as red requires that one already have the concept of redness and thereby the use of the word. It follows, just as Sellers says, that there is nothing to the conceptual meaning of a word that is not given by the formal and material rules of inference in which it figures. Although standard logic does not recognize material rules of inference, Sellers holds that language is unintelligible without them. I quote, material rules are as essential to meaning and hence to language and thought as formal rules, contributing the architectural detail of its structure within the flying buttresses of logical form. Another great quote. As the point is put some years later in Counterfactual's Dispositions in the Causal Modalities, it is only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects, even such basic expressions as words for the perceptible characteristics of molar objects, locate those objects in a space of implications, that they describe at all rather than merely label. The descriptive and the explanatory resources of language advance hand in hand, and to abandon the search for explanation is to abandon the attempt to improve language, period. To describe rather than merely label requires just those capacities that enable explanation. That is, rules of material inference that track or purport to track causal and other necessary relations. And it does so because in describing, one is answerable to how things are, however one takes them to be. If I'm labeling, I can use any principle of inclusion I like. The principle of inclusion can be that I am favorably disposed towards the thing that I label, or even merely that I am moved so to label it. Labeling need not answer to any objective features of things. Describing is different. A description is correct or incorrect in light of how things are. Hence, it is intelligible that one is describing only if one is responsive to how things are, answerable to the norm of truth. It must be in one's power to get it right, and hence in one's power to correct one's errors. And this requires, in turn, that there be material as well as formal rules of inference, because only so can there be conflict and second thoughts. Basic idea is simple. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Suppose that I see, or at least take myself to see, a thing to be at once F and G, despite the fact that there is a material rule in my language to the effect that being F entails being not G. That is, I can infer, given that the thing is F, that it is not G, even though it appears to be G. Although I find myself wanting to report observationally that the thing is G, I'm also inclined to state, as the conclusion of an inference, that it is not G. Either that, or maybe it's not F, or maybe it can't be inferred from something being F that it's not G. In short, I have an inconsistent triad. The thing is F, it's G, and being F entails being not G. Something has to give. And usually in practice, it's obvious what. This is what material rules of inference give us. Not only the capacity to explain, but also the capacity for second, better thoughts about how things are and about what is a reason for what. And it is this capacity for second thoughts, for self-correction, that ensures that we are describing, and on occasion misdescribing, rather than merely labeling. That in our talk, we are answerable to things as they are. Now, language, according to Sellers, is a system of formal and material rules of inference. And there are, he holds, this is again inference from Inference and Meaning, an indefinite number of such systems, each one of which can be regarded as a candidate for adoption by the animal which recognizes rules, and no one of which has an intuitable hallmark of royalty. They must compete in the marketplace of practice for employment by language users and be content to be adopted haltingly and schematically." End of quote. It is clear that Sellers himself thinks that it is some future language of science that ultimately will be the language we need in order to describe and explain things as they actually are. But although Sellers recognizes an indefinite number of languages, he recognizes only two images, two ways of experiencing the world. It is, for example, in the manifest image, in that way of experiencing, that we perceive a lawful relation among the pressure, temperature, and volume of a gas. This observed regularity is then explained in the scientific image by the kinetic theory of gases, which postulates unobservable little atoms and molecules flying around, bumping into each other, and the walls of the container. The behavior of these postulated unobservables in the scientific image explains the observed regularity in the manifest image. It is furthermore clear that Sellers thinks that only one of the two images can be right. I think this is a very strong assumption of the modern period in philosophy. Only one can be right. One can follow the lead of the philosophers of common sense and ordinary usage who accept, I quote, "the manifest image as real and attempt to understand the achievements of theoretical science in terms of this framework, subordinating the categories of theoretical science to its categories." That's one thing you can do. Or one can follow Sellers' lead, holding instead that in, we've had this quote a number of times, "the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not." Although, Sellers thinks, there is truth and error with respect to the manifest image, because, he says, it has a being which transcends the individual thinker, in the end, that way of experiencing is to be rejected as false. According to Sellers, it is our scientific theories and rationally constructed scientific languages that are the medium within which to achieve an adequate cognitive relation to reality, not our natural languages. Given that a language is a system of formal and material rules of inference, and the medium of our cognitive commerce with reality, we can see the project of science as that of discovering the world's own language, the system of formal and material rules of inference that will enable us to see, I think, better think, right? In fundamental physics, we don't see, we think. Think reality as it is in itself. Although we begin with our various colloquial languages, Ultimately, we will achieve the language that is the same for all rational beings insofar as they are rational, whatever their biological and cultural forms of life. And I mean, that narrative is basically what I'm trying to trace in Realizing Reason. There are, on this Salarzian view, no natural truths to contrast with the absolute truths of completed science. Now we need to see how incorporating two further Salarzian theses into the account makes the idea of natural truth, I want to say it makes it inevitable. Language use is clearly a rule-governed activity. There are norms, standards of correct usage. But according to Sellers, not all rules of language are rules of action, rules enjoining one to perform a certain action in particular circumstances, what Sellers calls ought-to-dos. Inference rules are such rules, but the rules governing what Sellers calls language entry transitions are not, because, as we already saw, to recognize the circumstances as the circumstances in which one ought to describe a thing as, say, red, is already to see the thing as red, to have tacitly taken it to be so. But seeing something as red is also not merely causal, merely a matter of being caused to act in a certain way, as one's foot is caused to rise by one's knee being tapped in a certain way. Seeing something as red is normative. One ought to see red things as red, and generally ought to see things as they are. Hence, we need to recognize, in addition to rules of action, ought-to-dos, also what Sellers calls rules of criticism, ought-to-bes. There is and can be no rule of action according to which, cateris paribus, one ought to say, this is red in the presence of red objects in sunlight. But there is a rule of criticism according to which, cateris paribus, one ought to respond to red objects in sunlight by uttering or being disposed to utter, this is red. These are quotes from Languages, Thought, and Communication. One ought to be that sort of person, the sort of person who is disposed in this way, which implies in turn, again a point that's already been made, an ought to do. People, others when one is young, but also oneself when one has become a competent speaker, ought to bring it about that one is that sort of person. But if so, then there's a sense in which, although perception belongs to a receptive faculty, and is something with respect to which one is passive, one is nonetheless responsible for seeing things as they are. Not directly responsible, but responsible nonetheless. This is our third and penultimate Salarzian theme, that to understand language and thought, we need to recognize not only rules of action governing inference, but also rules of criticism governing one's perceptual experiences of things. My final Salarzian theme is one that gets little attention, though it is, I think, absolutely fundamental. It is that inquiry, and I'm now quoting from Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind, my favorite line in that work, inquiry is rational, not because it has a foundation, but because it is a self-correcting enterprise which can put any claim in jeopardy, though not all at once. We know that the myth of the given is the idea that something non-conceptual, something outside the space of reasons, might nonetheless serve as a reason. That's a sort of McDowellian way of putting it. What this last Salarzian theme tells us is that there is another pitfall to be avoided as well. For it is all too easy for one, having learned that the given is a myth, to recoil to a position that is equally mythic. What we can think of, and I have in an earlier work described as the myth of the taken. The idea that we are not, after all, answerable to how things are, but only to the tribunal of experience, that is, to appearances of things to creatures like us, which, as long as we recognize the role of concepts in it, does not land us in the myth of the given. If all we are answerable to is the tribunal of experience, if we are not answerable to things as they are, however we experience them to be, then we are not answerable in a way that counts as rational. It must be things as they are that bear rationally on our empirical thinking if what we are doing is to be recognizable as thinking. it follows directly that the idea that there are things in the space of reason that are unrevisable in principle, hence not answerable to things as they are, as mere appearances are not so answerable, is just as much a myth as the given is. Indeed, I think this second myth, in fact, constitutes just another episode in the myth of the given, insofar as this myth aims to hold on to the idea that, that everything in the space of reasons is conceptually articulated, while denying what seems to be a consequence of that idea. Namely, anything in the space of reasons can be made the target of one's critically reflective scrutiny and corrected. I take it that Frege thinks this even about the laws of logic, that even the laws of logic are subject to revision. And I think this is actually a really important point. As Sellers sees, both these myths, both the idea of a non-conceptual given and the idea of an unrevisable taken, arise because one assumes a static, foundationalist picture of knowledge. The difference between them is only that the one assumes a given non-conceptual foundation, a foundation in things as they are, independent of however one takes them to be, while the other rejects any such foundation, holding instead that the touchstone of our knowledge can only be things as we take them to be. That is, in Sellers' own imagery, to accept the static foundationalist conception of knowledge is to be forced to choose between the picture of an elephant which rests on a tortoise, what supports the tortoise, and the picture of a great Hegelian serpent of knowledge with its tail in its mouth, where does it begin? The right response, according to Sellers, is to give up the static foundationalist picture. If we are adequately to understand the nature of our empirical knowledge, we need to focus not on the products of inquiry, but instead on its self-correcting processes, on the fact that whatever we find ourselves thinking, we can, in time, achieve a better view. And this seems deeply right. Suppose that there were something we thought that really was unrevisable in principle, something we just had to accept as true. The fact that we were so inclined to think would be no reason at all to think that what we think is actually true. If, on the other hand, anything we think can be called into question as reason sees fit, anything can be subject to critically reflective scrutiny, then its withstanding such scrutiny is reason to take it to be true, at least until we find new reasons to cast it again into doubt. This thought often goes missing in discussions of Sellers. One sees approving quotations of Sellers' earlier remark about foundations, his remark, and this often gets quoted, that if there is a logical dimension in which other empirical propositions rest on observation reports, there is another logical dimension in which the latter rest on the former. But there, the quotation tends to end, despite the fact, well, yeah, I found this in one of your works, Jim, and it's also in some McDowell. They just stop the quotation right there, despite the fact that Sellers immediately goes on. Above all, he says, emphasis, above all, the picture is misleading because of its static character. Now, it's possible that this further remark is omitted because it is thought to be inextricably tied to Sellers' scientism, his thought that in the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, of what is not that it is not. This, I think, is to get it exactly backwards. As we will soon see, Sellers' rejection of static foundationalism is not grist for his scientific mill, but precisely what we need to reveal its fatal flaw. On Sellers' account, the whole way of experiencing the framework that he calls the manifest image is to be rejected as false. And we are clearly supposed to take this as a move in the space of reasons, That framework was subjected to critically reflective scrutiny and is to be jettisoned in favor of the scientific image. Again, this framework in which you think you have to choose. It is, however, one thing to reject some claim within a framework, and something else entirely to reject a whole framework. To reject the framework of the manifest image is to say, in effect, that everyday experience is a mere appearance caused in us, that it is not really real. The fact that the image has a being that transcends the individual thinker, which we saw was to ground the distinction between truth and falsity, now must be understood on a par with the fact that a game transcends individual players. Truth and falsity have no application in the case of something that has the status of a game. To reject the framework of the manifest image, then, is to claim that the observed regularities, say among pressure, temperature, and volume of a gas, are not actually true, not in fact answerable to how things are, but are only an appearance caused in us, an appearance to be explained by science. And that, I think, is just the myth of the taken. The myth that in the end our thinking is answerable only to things as we take them to be, as they show up in our experience, however they in fact are. We, of course, do say that science explains the appearances. For example, the appearance of the rising and setting of the sun by the movement of the earth around the sun. And there is a sense in which it is a task of science to explain all the ways that things show up for us, the ways they show up in illusory experience as much as the ways they show up in veridical experience. But these features of the practice of science must not be confused with what Sellers is saying. The appearance of the rising and setting sun is not an appearance in the same sense that Sellers suggests the manifest image is an appearance. We do not merely seem to see the sun rise and set, we really do see it. There's nothing illusory in our ordinary experience of the movement of the sun, even though in a different sense, we say that the apparent motion of the sun is due to the actual motion of the earth. It is similarly a task of science to explain why, say, a straight stick looks bent when half immersed in water. But that is because it's true that the stick looks that way. The datum to be explained is not a mere appearance caused in us. It is a fact, one that answers to how things actually are. In Sellers' scientific picture, according to which our everyday claims do not actually describe how things are, everyday experience is a mere appearance caused in us, an appearance that is ultimately to be explained by our best scientific theories. This is some of his Kantianism. But if everyday experience is such an appearance, if it is not itself answerable to how things actually are, then it is Sellers who falls into the Hegelian trap of the serpent with its tail in its mouth. That is the myth of the taken. If all our scientific theories answer to is our experience of things conceived as a mere appearance, if those appearances are not themselves answerable to things as they are, then the practice of science is not and cannot be a rational endeavor. It cannot be rational because it is not in that case answerable to things as they are, but only to things as they appear to us. It is only if our ordinary sensory perceptions of things are themselves rational, that is, answerable to the norm of truth, that we can make intelligible the project of science as that of determining how things are in an absolute sense, the same for all rational beings. Everyday experience is not a mere appearance to be explained by science. It is our first sensory mode of cognitive access to reality, one that can be supplemented, though I think never supplanted, that's the point, by the subsequent non-sensory, purely rational mode of cognitive access that we achieve in the exact sciences. Everyday sensory experience is the domain of natural truth. And in this domain of truth, as in any other, although where we start is contingent and arbitrary, a function of accidents of our history, our context, our biology, and our environment, how we go on need not be. And it will not be just insofar as we exercise our powers of reason, insofar as we are critically reflective and self-correcting. So we've seen that not only is nothing given for thought from outside the space of reasons, nothing is unrevisable in principle. Anything that we think can be called into question and corrected. Of course, at any particular moment in history, some errors and confusions will be less accessible to rational, reflective criticism than others. One is responsible for how one takes things to be, even in one's perceptual experience of things. Nevertheless, one's errors can be more or less explicable in the light of the historical context. Still, errors are errors, and ultimately they ought to be corrected. And this is intelligible precisely because language is socially rather than biologically evolved. Only if it is completely contingent, a matter of historical accident, how one takes things to be, at least at first, only if that's the way things are, that it is completely contingent, can one correct those errors, come to see things as they are. Even our everyday understanding of things can be improved. And it can be improved because, first, there are material rules of inference that enable contradictions to arise in what I seem to see to be so, and am apparently entitled to infer is so. And there are rules of criticism that entail, in turn, rules of action, the upshot of which is that I'm responsible not only for what I do, for instance, infer, but also for what I perceive. I am a rational being, answerable to the norm of truth. I am responsible for all that I think and to things as they are. And from this, natural truth follows. Consider, for example, the fact that we have, all of us, been acculturated to give greater credence to an utterance by a male than to the exact same words uttered with the same degree of assurance and air of authority spoken by a female. The male just sounds smarter, more interesting and creative, more knowledgeable, and more authoritative. Similarly, black males in the US are all too often perceived by whites in the US as particularly dangerous, threatening, and violent, even when there is no discernible difference between the appearance and behavior of the black male and the appearance and behavior of his white counterpart, save, of course, for the fact that one is black and the other is white. These are both well-established phenomena. And these are, I think, perceptions. We've learned that these are perceptions, as manifest to a perceiver as the blue of the sky or the 5 fingers on my left hand. One does not, in such a case, infer, even unconsciously, that things are thus and so. One literally sees, or at least seems to see, them to be so. And yet, there seems in these cases clearly to be a fact of the matter that we're getting wrong. The fact of being female or black does not provide sufficient grounds for the perceptions one has in those cases. And if Sellers is right, the fact of the matter in such cases is nonetheless one to which we are answerable. One ought to see things, in this instance other people, as they are, not merely as one has been socialized, acculturated to see them. And one ought to do this because although perception is passive, one can, and insofar as one is rational, ought to, bring it about that one is the sort of perceiver who sees things correctly, as they are. Now, I want to generalize that point. The view of reality that we achieve in fundamental physics is one divested by design of all that is distinctively human. It is purely rational and maximally objective. The view that would be the same for all rational beings, whatever the accidents of their biology, their culture, their history. Nevertheless, it is qua human and not qua purely rational that we engage in the practice of science, even though, again, it is qua rational that we contemplate reality as it is revealed through that practice. We need both what Sellers calls the scientific image and what he calls the manifest image. That's probably not the best way to think about them at this point, but what is at issue now is only whether there is the manifest image, that is, one such image valid for all human beings, or whether there are in fact many such images, perhaps even as many as there are natural languages. I've argued that if Sellers' four theses are correct, the answer is that although, as a matter of fact, we find wildly diverging conceptions of the everyday world in the various cultures that have emerged over the course of history, there ought not to be such diverging conceptions insofar as only one such view can be right, that there is the truth about reality as it shows up for beings like us. Of course, there are also matters of taste and convention, but how things are in reality as it is revealed in our sensory experience is not merely a matter of taste or convention. I'm going to try and convince you of that. As human beings, we share a certain biological form of life. We are, or begin as, animals of one certain sort. And our languages, we have seen, are utterly contingent. Anything we think could, in principle, be called into question. We also know that we could, each of us, learn to see things as those in other cultures do by immersing ourselves in their languages and cultures. I could, for example, come to be able to see the depiction of the fish in the pond, not only in terms of objects with their properties, as I, as a Westerner, am prone to, but also, and primarily, in terms of context and relationships, as, say, someone from China would. Now, if I am merely looking at a picture, a depiction, then I think there's nothing to choose between the two ways of seeing. I can look at the picture one way, I can look at it the other. Neither way of regarding the picture, by contrast with the other, seems to me to be true or correct. But the same cannot be said when we turn to the things themselves. If I'm looking not at a depiction of fish in a pond, but at some actual fish in a pond, then I think there is a fact of the matter how they ought to be regarded, whether atomistically or relationally and contextually, or in some other way. Can one adequately understand fish if one considers them independently of their environment? The question seems obviously a good one, a question about the fish, however I have been acculturated to think of or even see them. But if that question is a good one, then there is natural truth. Perhaps it will be objected again that in all such cases it is merely a matter of taste or of convention how we regard this or that thing. I do not see how it can be. Suppose you like chocolate ice cream best, and I prefer instead the taste of vanilla ice cream. I can, in that case, understand your liking chocolate ice cream better than vanilla ice cream, but I cannot experience what you experience, namely chocolate ice cream tasting better than vanilla ice cream. If I could do that, then I would like the taste of chocolate ice cream better than the taste of vanilla ice cream. There's no natural truth about which of the two tastes best. It's only a matter of taste. But again, one and the same person can learn to see the fish, both as Westerners tend to and as Easterners tend to. So you don't have that same problem in this case. And yet the two views are incompatible. They cannot both be right. Or so the Westerner would argue. An Easterner might suggest instead that they're both needed fully to account for how things are with the fish. The point remains that we cannot merely leave each to his or her own view of things. The question as to the nature of the fish is not a question about how things seem to one, as questions of taste are. Nor, obviously, is it merely a matter of convention how things are with the fish, as it is a convention which side of the road one should drive on. There were fish long before there were conventions. The question about the fish is a question about how things are, however we perceive them to be. How rational animals, such as us, ought rationally to perceive and think about fish. It is a question of natural truth. The project of science is to understand nature apart from anything peculiar to our human nature. And our Western ways of thinking, reaching all the way back to the ancient Greeks, have been highly conducive to the progress of that project. It does not follow that Western ways of thinking are correct, or more correct than Eastern ways, or indeed any other ways, when it comes to our everyday view of the world. We are rational animals, and insofar as we are answerable to things as they are. We are responsible for what we think, and even, we have seen, for how we perceive things to be. Our ways of seeing are first formed through our acculturation, and they can be improved. Even in everyday life, we are answerable to how things are, to things as they are, however we take them to be. Conceptual meaning is revisable through revisions in what we take to be the rules of inference, material and formal, and revisions in those rules, together with habituation and practice, can radically change the way we perceive things, enabling us thereby to perceive things as they are. We saw that Sellers envisages a community of all rational beings. There can be no such community, I think. Rational beings with a radically different form of life from our own would be unintelligible to us as we would be to them. We could not learn their natural languages, could not learn to see the world through their eyes, assuming they had eyes, which there's no reason to think they would. But if, as I've argued, there is natural truth, then there can be a community of human beings, what Sellers describes as the brotherhood of man. Sellers, we saw, thought that we had nearly achieved such a brotherhood. I don't think anyone would think that today. The cultural differences that divide us seem to be as deep and as divisive as they could possibly be. All the more reason, then, to take up the task of determining how we ought to think about the everyday perceptible world. We are, of course, not starting from scratch any more than we ever are. We begin where we are, with all that we think we know and understand, and all that is available to be learned. What we need is the sort of rational, reflective criticism that is the hallmark of reason. We need to think about the different ways people have come to understand reality and to come to better second thoughts about how things actually are. We need to attend to natural truth. Thank you.
And we have some time for some questions.
Thanks very much. I like that a lot. And I like the self-correcting quote, too. I like that one. So I'm trying to figure out how Sellers' story, which I don't necessarily agree with, the relocation move, the falsity of the manifest image for that reason. But I'm trying to see where it's wrong, not just because of a theory of perception that's optional, but for some a priori reason having to do with the myth of the taken. That's what seems to be, that there's a philosophical, it's incoherent. So I take Sellers to say that the normal manifest image, there's a blue table, isn't about explaining appearances. It's about explaining how things appear in terms of how they are. It's the table appears blue. There appears to me to be a blue table because there is a blue table. So he's perfectly happy with our perceptual faculties reveal how things are. He sees that from the beginning. Now, of course, here's the theory he has, that it turns out that that there's things we learn through philosophy and science, that a better account of the truth that's revealed in it being true, that that's the way things are, has it a very complicated relational thing having to do with states of the perceiver too, such that it fairly radically transforms our understanding of what that truth is. So it's a successor conception of that truth. So all along the way there, things are conceptualized. There is a non-conceptual thing that's given, but it's conceptualized as far as it enters into that story. It's a self-correcting story. So where does it kind of philosophically go wrong? I think it goes wrong because there's other theories of perception that don't need to make that radical move. But I don't think his philosophical apparatus is somehow debilitated. No.
Well, I, as I tried to indicate, I think a lot of what he's saying we can use, and it's helpful. I mean, for him, the color is, as it were, in us ultimately, right? And so
Well, it starts in the object.
well, that's where we think it is,
Right.
but it turns out that that's not where it is. And I think that, one of the things I wanted to do was say, no, we need to rethink that picture of perception, have a much more Gibsonian picture, and realize, and
I agree with that.
okay, realize that we don't have to choose, that his picture of the progress of science, it's sort of like, Eddington's two tables. You can't have both of them. You can have the perceptible one, or you can have the atoms in the void one. And that's because of a particular understanding of what is the nature of our cognitive access that, is characteristic from Kant onward. But you can develop a different conception of the nature of our cognitive access to reality that I sort of gestured at with my example of the plant and the water, according to which they aren't in competition in any way, that we have our human sort of sensory access to reality, and we achieve, over the course of this sort of fabulous intellectual adventure we've been on called science, this other mode of access to the same reality, but now it's purely rational, purely mathematical, as it turns out. I don't think that was an accident, but it becomes a purely thought relation to reality, but they're both cognitive access to reality, and they're not in competition. The Martian scientists, this whole story goes through for them too. They need natural truth because they need, it's as the rational animals that they are, that they're practicing their science that ultimately will converge with ours insofar as we actually succeed in stripping away everything accidental and biological and so on. So I think there were large themes in Sellers that made it seem to him, connected with his conception of perception, his Kantian conception, that made it seem to him that you couldn't have both pictures. And I think we now have the resources to understand why that's not true. And so reinstating, developing this conception of natural truth.
Can I just say one more thing? So I agree with much that you say in the end. But Sellers thought it could well have turned out true that we just perceive the manifest world in a way that reveals it to be the way that things really are. He does. He says if instrumentalism had been true, he says the Strassonian picture of the world, were it not for these things that are revealed to us by science but not by more philosophy, then the Strassonian picture would have pictured the way things really are. Perception is for him a faculty that reveals how things are, but it's because of the self-correcting passage precisely that he thinks we can preserve that manifest reality, but in a way that gives a more adequate truth. Now, I reject that latter claim, as you do, but not on philosophical grounds having to do with the myth of the taken, which I don't understand how it does it, but we can talk about that.
You said one thing that sort of threw me for a loop, and I think
Only
it
one
ramifies.
thing? I was trying to be really outrageous.
Maybe I was so busy thinking about the loop that I missed some others. And that is that you think that inference rules are ought-to-dos, but they're not. They're ought-to-bes, right? Otherwise, we're into the Achilles and the tortoise problem. And that ramifies also because then, in fact, the language entries and the language exits are just as much ought-to-bes, and they're no less relevant to meaning and content than the language transitions, which are also ought-to-bes. So could you say some more about that?
Well, we know that ought-to-bes, if there ought-to-bes, there need to be ought-to-dos.
Right.
And yes, obviously we can't all the inference rules, but I think there is a sense in which for him inference rules are, you can be told, look, if you claim this, you should infer this. Yeah, you can just be told that, and then you can use that rule, and that's an ought to do. Now, there are going to be ought to be's underlying it, I agree. So the two are always sort of in interaction with each other. I think that's right. But I think for him, when he's talking about formal and material rules of inference in inference and meaning, he's precisely contrasting the language entry transitions from material rules of inference. And that...
Well, so I was also trying to push towards the idea that, I mean, you say here that there's nothing to conceptual meaning not determined by material and formal rules of inference, and I actually don't think that's right.
Well, that's what he says, right? That's what he says in inference and meaning. Although, I mean, this came up yesterday. Was it in your talk that you both need those ought to be's as part of your understanding of language, because as he says, if we didn't have these responses to things, our language would have no application. But he also wants to say, and I think he has grounds for saying this, so it's a little complicated, the picture, that in a different way, the meaning of the language is exhausted by the formal and material rules of inference. So you need both, but they have slightly different statuses when you're thinking about language. And that seems to be his view, and I don't take issue with that.
Thanks, Danielle. That's very interesting. I just want to be a little bit skeptical about the main conclusion. And my worry is that it's committed to a kind of homogeneity in human populations, which is, at least in some respects, empirically implausible, but which is certainly not sort of as a priori as it would need to be for your argument. So two examples of this. I mean, it seems to be true as a matter of empirical fact that for any particular sensory modality, there are perfectly well-functioning members of our rational community who simply don't have any sensations of that kind. They're blind or deaf or lack touch or something like that. Secondly, it seems to me to be quite coherent that we could have the kind of human community that we have, and yet it still be true that for any particular sensory modality, we could find sub-communities who differ radically on that particular sensory dimension. So they have radically different color vision or something like that. Whereas it seems to me your conception of natural truth is just in effect ruling that out.
Yeah, actually, I had not obviously thought at all about that kind of case, partly because I may be stepping on a minefield here. All of these people are acculturated into a language. So they're going to be part of some community that has, members that have all different kinds of abilities. I think that so I think I could probably sort of deal with the fact that yes, different people have some different sense modalities, but of course you have to have some that are shared. I mean, think of Helen Keller. If you don't have any sense modalities that are shared with other speakers of the language, you're never going to learn the language. So there has to be some, and this is why we couldn't learn the Martian language, I'm assuming, because if lions could talk, we couldn't understand them because their bodies are too different or something. But what I'm depending on is the fact that there is enough commonality, just because we have, we're all animals of the same sort, I'm assuming, and the fact that we can always learn another human language. That seems to me a really important datum.
Okay, good. So I think that probably what needs to happen is that the story about the implicit quantifiers needs to get a lot sharper. And so where you say necessarily valid for available to all human beings, that needs to be a lot more nuanced.
Yeah.
But then the question is going to be whether once all that nuancing has been done, whether there is, in the sense you want, still a core of natural truths, or whether the notion of natural truth becomes, in some sense, a much more local one, which would obviously be in tension with the very idea that there are such things.
Right. And I'm counting on the fact that, with sort of rational reflective criticism on the various ways that we view things, we might be able to come to a reasoned understanding that we could all recognize and say, yeah, that seems right. For now, until somebody else joins the conversation and says, no, you guys, what about this?
Yeah, so I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about eventually getting to the Martians in that way than you are. By being, I don't know if it's pessimistic or optimistic about the degree of variation that there is in human population.
I wonder if I could maybe put one more question over here since the whole room's not been represented. Over here, last. Maybe somebody who has a. Here, go ahead.
Okay, so I had just a quick objection, which I guess is a follow-up to Hugh's, and then also I was going to ask if you had encountered Susanna Siegel's work on perception, but I'll start with the objection. So I guess like if you ran into beings that you couldn't causally interact with, which I guess you wouldn't be running into them, then certainly it seems like you couldn't come to understand their form of life and form a rational community with them. But anything short of that, I don't know that we should rule out a priori the possibility of coming to understand each other. I think this might be the sort of thing that we might just have to wait and see.
Yeah, the thought is, and the first chapter of Realizing Reason has a lot to say about this, that our everyday languages are deeply sort of sensory and embedded in sort of the actual contingencies of our lives. And, you know, this is sort of why translation can be easier or harder depending on sort of distance in space and time, but it's always to some extent possible. Whereas I'm imagining with the Martians, you know, they have no sensory modalities in common with us. Their form of life is totally the way they take nutrition, the way they reproduce. It's completely alien to us. It's nothing like the way we do these things. Whereas in all human communities, well, you know, everybody needs to eat and everybody needs to sleep, and, you know, there's sort of things you can count on that other humans are going to need. So understanding, you know, their jokes, their literature, their poetry, their form of life is so alien to ours that I think it's perfectly sort of reasonable thing. No, you can't. You'd have to have that kind of body. You'd have to have that kind of experience of the world. And short of, you know, if you can tell me a way I can get that, then I would feel differently. But that's why I think it's the mathematics that has been completely purged of all that is sensory and, you know, that is, so mathematics starts out very connected to the kinds of bodies and the kind of sensory apparatus that we have. But over the course of history, what happens is all of that gets purged of the mathematics. So, you know, the arc of development in Realizing Reason, the end is that you're doing a kind of mathematics that has no sort of, it really is sort of purely rational mathematics, at least in principle. Maybe we haven't quite got there, but that's the idea. So that anybody with any kind of body could understand that, providing we could at least understand their notation or, you know, whatever they're doing their mathematics in. That seems perfectly reasonable to think we could make sense of it. But making sense of the sort of everyday things of their lives when their everyday lives are nothing. Their bodies are nothing like ours. We can't even actually always tell where one of them ends and the next one starts. You know, I mean, it could be anything. But they could still be rational animals. So that's that's what's grounding my sense that their form of life could be totally alien, but their completed science needn't be, and that our bodies are sufficiently alike to each other's, although as Hugh says, they're not absolutely alike, but that enables us to share a view of the world.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.